between newspaper. The stem is 12 inches. It's 15 inches from here to there, and it's 19 inches.
Oh my word.
I know it's a world record. And I don't know how to preserve it.
That is great.
Isn't it something?
Amazing.
So,
That's amazing.
be very careful with it.
And I'll just add on to you, I know she's looking for back t-shirts, so if any of you got t-shirts that we're not here yet.
Well, Nancy Bush has a collection of t-shirts, and she has been documenting them. But not too long ago, Nancy White, who's designed some of these over the years, just brought a big pile of them. And so we thought it would be fun to show people, because look how clever they are. Look at that one, that Guemes Islander. And when my grandparents' house, my aunt lived in my grandparents' house, and when she had to move off the island, her sister said, well, let's keep the house and we'll all share it. And so for Christmas, she gave 24 people in our family a shirt. She made 24 shirts. And my grandparents' house is now the Staff LLC. So every time we have a work party, we wear our shirts, and most of them have, paint on them. Anyway, if you have a shirt that you've outgrown or whatever, and want to donate it to the Historical Society, we're going to document them all. And there are many more than these.
And our December meeting is going to be just a kind of a get-together. There won't be a regular program, but you're welcome to come. If you have a shirt from the island, wear it, bring it, or whatever, and we'll take pictures of it, and we'll talk about where it came from and that kind of stuff at our next meeting. So.
The Environmental Trust did some too, so if you don't remember.
Yeah, the library has a bunch of them that they've had over the years and stuff, so it'd be kind of nice to get if not a collection for the Historical Society, at least documenting what happened. So we'll move along then. Tonight, you've seen our advertisement for Down the Hatch. We have Martin Taylor here, whose family's been on the island for a long time, had a lot of history with Anacortes. So welcome, Martin. He'll tell us about his family here.
Thank you. All righty. I guess I would just start by saying that I tend to prefer a little give and take, and then just sort of a lecture format. So feel free at any time to ask questions or make observations. I've had a couple of conversations with various family members about historical memories, and I realized that not everybody remembers everything the same way. So if there's something that stands to challenge or correction, feel free to jump in. But I appreciate conversation and being able to take questions and observations as we go along too. I guess I would start by saying that my family, I'm third generation on Guemes, but my family actually is fourth generation in Skagit County. My great-grandfather was a logger and logged out in the Nookachamps. Before he did that, he actually went on the Klondike Gold Rush twice. He and a partner of his name was Eugene Taylor, and he and a partner of his went into the Klondike on the gold rush and went up there and prospected for gold and went broke. Hiked in over Chilkoot Pass.
Wow.
Came out, came back down here, went back to work, made some more money, and went back a second time over Chilkoot Pass again the second time. And that time they got gold, they hit gold. And at least the family recollection is they made $70,000 between the two of them,
Wow.
which in those days was quite a bit of money. And so his partner went into banking in Skagit County, but my great-grandfather went into logging and logged much of the Nookachamps area out northeast of Mount Vernon, and then went up into BC, and he logged with horses and with oxen out in the Nookachamps. went to BC and logged, and but did flume logging up there, where they'd log way up in the mountains and then float the logs down in the flume. So he would be 4 generations back, but then beginning with my Grandpa Frank and Grandma Marjorie Taylor, that's where the Guemes connection really started. And the first family story about the two of them on Guemes was when they were courting each other. They came over, they had a skiff, and they rowed over with a skiff to Square Bay and climbed up, you know, there's that bluff on the east side of Square Bay that looks over at Huckleberry. And so they came over with a picnic and went up on that bluff, and beautiful, just like tonight with a big full moon, and they had their picnic. And then the moon was so pretty, they stayed a little longer and stayed a little longer, and pretty soon it was pretty late. And finally they got in the skiff and rowed home, and my great-grandfather on the maternal side was waiting up, Marjorie, as you might expect, and he wanted to know where they'd been. And she said, "Oh, Dad, we were over on Guemes, and the moon came up, and it was so beautiful, we just couldn't leave. We just had to sit there and keep enjoying the view." He said, "That's really good." He said, "I'm so happy you enjoyed that view." He said, "Because you're going to get to enjoy that view from your bedroom window for the next month." So anyway, that's really one of the first family recollections in terms of my grandparents being on Guemes.
And say their names again?
That was Frank Taylor. He didn't have a middle name, just Frank. Sparing in language in the family. And Marjorie Rogers. And the Rogers girls, which I'll get to in a little bit, my grandma had 2 sisters, but the last name was Rogers. Yeah, and they actually came from Montana. Her dad was a shoemaker and also a farmer in Montana. They all went to town one day and cut bank and came back to the farm after being in town, and their house had burned down.
Oh, wow.
So they packed up and came down to Cordes, moved in with relatives, and had $1.47 in their pocket when they got to Anacortes. But then he became a shoemaker in town and did that for years and years.
What year was that? About, you know?
My grandma was born in 1898. So I would imagine it was 1910s sometime. Grandpa was born in 1892. He was a little older, so yeah. So as you can see from some of the stuff up front, my family is a fairly pelagic family. Nobody's very comfortable when you're away from the water, and my grandfather Taylor, when he came, moved from Mount Vernon over here, he got involved in the maritime industry and did a whole variety of things on the waterfront. One of the earliest things, some of you may have seen this from the Anacortes Museum, but this was a half model, which is a boat building, pre-building technique for developing your hull in a model fashion that my grandfather Frank Taylor and Harry Rickaby contracted, and this was one of the early launch ferries to Guemes Island. My grandfather had a couple of nicknames. One was, I just found this out from my sisters actually this last weekend. But one of his nicknames was Launch Man, which I'd never heard before. And I'm assuming that was because of this launch that they used to come to Guemes, bring people to Guemes. Another nickname from the shipyard was Poach. And my dad always said it wasn't because of the way he liked his eggs. Apparently during the Depression years when he was running the shipyard, he would keep a .22 rifle at the shipyard and shoot some of the ducks in the bay, and Dad said they ate a lot of ducks during the Depression. At any rate, my grandfather Taylor was involved with that. He went into World War I and went into submarine chasers in the North Atlantic as an engineer. He got kicked out of school in 8th grade for misbehavior, but ended up going to Columbia University and getting a degree in marine engineering from Columbia, with having only graduated from the 8th grade. He shot the principal in the hind end with a pin, and that was the end of his lower education.
Martin, do you
Yeah.
know how long the elk was? How the dimensions of the elk?
42 feet long. I don't know what her beam or depth were. It's a pretty hull, and if you see pictures of that boat in the water, it was really a pretty and slippery hull. Yeah. I don't know if, maybe you know more about Mangan's Landing. I don't know if there was a landing there that they were able to actually dock the boat at, or if they had to anchor out and go ashore with a skiff. I don't know that myself. Maybe somebody here does.
I don't know for sure, but what was it powered by?
I think it was probably some kind of a small gas engine.
So it probably could get up to Mangan's Wharf then, I would imagine.
Could be. Yeah, maybe on a slacker tide or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, my granddad was in the war, and then he came back, and he went to work for Gilkey Towing. I had a good conversation with Charles about this a couple of weeks ago, and they were trying to put together a fleet of tugs, and they needed somebody who had good machinery expertise and a good ability to understand vessels and what made vessels work and not work very well, which is always a lot. And so he went to work and helped them assemble a fleet of tugs that then became Gilkey Brothers Towing around the area for quite a few years. And they had the Sea King and the Beheda that blew up off Huckleberry, probably a steam engine failure. Tug blew up and sank. The Beatrice Bear, which was the one that my grandfather was chief engineer on for the most part. And he worked for them for many years. And then they sold to Pacific Towboat, and then he became the manager of Pacific Tow, my granddad, Pacific Towboat, and their tugboat fleet, and then the shipyard over here, which he called Ulcer Gulch, because of the stress of trying to run a shipyard through the Depression and after. But always very much oriented to the saltwater and to the marine industry. And my dad, who many of you knew, grew up in that sort of culture and environment. And in those days, they would actually, at least the Gilkey brothers would, they'd let crew members take their kids on the tugs sometimes. So Dad had lots of stories from being on the Bear and going along as a kid with a bunch of guys on a tugboat and stories about that. Remember him telling about being on Lake Washington or Lake Union with the tug, and they were going to come back up here, and for some reason the skipper let him steer the tug. Well, the skipper went to get a cup of coffee, and there were lots of crates that had been dumped into Lake Union. So Dad said he was peering over the wheel, steering, trying to hit as many crates as in the lake. And the skipper got back a little bit less than pleased. But that was part of his growing up. And if you want to pass stuff around, or so here's my grandfather's chief engineer's license, and it was the 8th issue of that, and it was 1950 when it was issued. And typically licenses are good for 5 years, so he had gotten started at a pretty early age.
What year was your dad born?
He was born in 1925. Yeah. He was premature, and he was born at home. And the doctor put him in a shoebox and put him on the door of the wood stove oven to keep him warm. I think he was like 3 pounds or something. Yeah. And so, back to some of the tugboating stuff. This picture, it's a little hard to get a perspective, but this was the codfish schooner Azalea. And she was a sister ship of the Wawona, which is probably more well-known and more familiar. But what they would do is they would go north with the codfish schooner with dories on deck, and then the crew members would come back to the big boat every night, but during the day they would go out and set ground tackle and fish codfish or halibut out of the dories. But the sailing ships didn't have any power, and so they would sail up off into the Bering Sea or Gulf of Alaska someplace to fish. When they came back down here to get in from the ocean, they'd have tugboats that would go out and pull them in. So this picture was actually taken, you can look at it later, but you can see that there's a tow line right here, and the boat was being towed in from Cape Flattery. And my dad took the picture off the stern of the tug when he was 12. And Dad said they left Anacortes in the fog, and all they had for navigation was whistle, blow the whistle, and compass. And he said they sailed all the way to Cape Flattery and met the ship, put a line on her, towed her back to Anacortes, and he said they never saw land from when they left to when they got back. But the skipper could blow the whistle and listen and hear the echo and know it well enough to know where he was.
Was that a Gilkey tug?
It was. It was actually the Beatrice Bear. Yeah, yeah.
So how long was that boat?
I would guess the Azalea was probably 200 and
Oh, wow. Oh, she was big. Yeah.
240, maybe,
Wow.
something like that. Yeah, I don't know exactly. The Bear, I think, was 72. Yeah,
But the length?
yeah. The Bear had a Washington S-step diesel for power, which turned about 310 RPMs wide open. You'll hear some of the other old tugs around once in a while. That was the kind of diesel it was.
Did you say that the sister ship was Wawona?
Yeah, if not sister ship, very similar.
That's like a Yosemite name.
Is that right?
Wawona, yeah.
Okay.
I may be known elsewhere, but it's certainly very prominent.
Yeah.
Is that the one that's down in Lake Union at the?
That's the one.
She
Okay,
is.
was the Relief the same kind of ship that used to be out at the cave?
The Relief, I believe, was a
Light ship.
light ship, exactly.
So she wasn't built the same way?
No, light ships were really built just to be on anchor
Oh.
and provide a navigational aid, but not so much. These boats were for carrying salt fish. Robinson Fish Company in Anacortes, who you probably are familiar with, they were big in the salt cod and that kind of industry.
I think Susie Gwast has worked on the Wawona.
Really?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah,
It's been restored and kept up, hasn't it?
I believe it
It's-
has.
it's
Yes, it's
operating. It's an educational ship.
right,
yeah.
exactly, yeah. The tug, the Bear, that was towing that boat in, was built locally, I believe in Bellingham. But I remember them saying that the frames on the boat were yew wood from Cyprus. And the yew frames were 4 inches by 4 inches. So if you can imagine yew wood that big. And
Yeah.
and then they packed salt, he had the planking and then the frames and then a lining inside on the frames, and they packed rock salt between the lining and the planking to help preserve the boat.
Salt.
Yeah, a little tough on fastenings, but sure made the wood last. So, my grandparents started camping. I live back from the resort, about a quarter of a mile, I guess. And my grandparents started camping there on that beach in the 1920s. And my dad recollected from just when he was just very small, they had built tent platforms, and then they had a cooking tent and a sleeping tent. And they would come over, he and Grandma and Grandpa and my Uncle Roger would come over and set up tents there that they would leave through the whole summer. And they didn't own the place, but they just camped there. And they did that for many, many years. And Dad said they would come over, Grandpa would be at the shipyard, and Dad and Roger and Grandma would be over here on the beach for the summer. And Grandpa would row over with a skiff on the weekends and spend the weekend here, and then row back to work on Monday morning. And he said they would stay into the fall even after school had started. He said we'd stay until the sheets were just too damp to stand it anymore. And then move back to Anacortes for the rest of the winter. And they did that until 1938.
So Martin, they rode around from town to
Yeah,
the north end. They,
yeah.
I mean, we wouldn't normally think of doing that today.
Right.
I'm just trying to get a perspective.
Yeah.
And you also
Yeah.
said they rode to Square Bay, and that was normal from Anacortes to row that far.
It was, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There was, I mean, unless you had more money, there probably weren't too many auctions, and maybe a little bit of sale, but Grandpa would row over from the shipyard because he had access to, they're probably Harry Rickaby skiffs.
And it was their choice to row all the way instead of rowing to the south end and walk or
Yeah,
get a ride,
yeah,
horse.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
Dad did talk about sometimes going for groceries in town, and he said they would walk from my place over and catch the launch across and go, you know, buy groceries at one of the little neighborhood
Right.
stores,
Yeah.
then walk all the way back.
Mm.
So,
Oh.
yeah, yeah, well,
I don't know at what point, somebody probably knows what time the road system went in here, but was it just trails then, or were there vehicle transport on the island in, say, the 20s and 30s? Or was it primarily trails that later became roads?
yeah. I believe it was roads, at least enough for horses.
A horse and wagon and stuff?
Yeah,
Well, in the 1920s, the Elverson tracks were down there in North Beach, and so the road went from the ferry up North Beach, and it stopped at Lewis Lane. You know where Sally's house is? That's a section line, and there weren't any roads past that for a while.
okay.
So I can see there wouldn't be a way to drive down to the resort area where you all were.
Yeah,
But I don't know when that was put in. Lee Lewis was the guy with the bulldozer.
so he must have built the road. I don't know if it was him or if it was perhaps somebody else, but this picture is kind of a funky picture. I'll pass it around. But this is a picture of the flat down where my cabin is, and it was before any of my relatives' cabins were built. And at that time, they'd drive down to the resort area and then drive around the flat. And then, I'm not sure what year, but they built the road down that we use now down the hillside, and maybe that was Lewis that built that. I thought maybe Marvin Schultz had.
Marvin, I know, at least improved Agate Lane down there, if not built it completely.
Okay,
So,
you can pass that just around
The
too.
the road, in 1954, the only paved road was up to the end of our property. The rest of it was all gravel.
Huh.
Which property of yours, Al?
On Guemes Island Road.
Where,
That
The
was
straight-
the end of the paved road.
just across from Butel's, you mean?
Yeah,
Yeah, that was the end of, wow.
yeah,
50,
1954.
And remember in Bill Burlingame's book, I just read it, so I know this, he said all the roads were gravel when he was a kid and rode the school bus.
Yep.
And he left the island in 55, so that was about when they started paving properly.
That was it, and Lee Lewis had the road grader, and he was working for the county and cleaned all the ditches out, put it up on the road and graded it all back and kept the shoulders just perfect. And
I'll be
so
darned.
it was, yeah,
Well, he probably built the road down the hill then. It serves Boscov's and Middlestats and Charles's and us and everybody else down there now. Yeah.
Well, I think that the roads were built, but that, I don't know when all the roads got built, but there's some roads that are not on the map today that were on the map then.
Okay.
And one of them went clear up on the south end of the island from Kelly's Point and went clear along the bluff down, and then that was the where West Shore Drive was not there. That road went clear up. I remember riding horses along that road there, and you could see the two wagon tracks across there. But it's good that they moved the road, and they moved it because of the bluff sloughing.
Well, my family camped down where that picture is taken for years and years. And then my Grandma Rogers, who had two sisters, Mabel Sutter and Katie Davis, and their husbands, Otto Sutter and Ralph Davis, all got together and started talking about that piece of property down there and whether or not they'd be able to continue to use it into the future. Then they decided that they should probably try to buy it. And so Jack Kidd, you know that name or not? The Jack Kidd owned it. And so the three couples bought just a little over 10 acres from Jack Kidd, about roughly 400 feet of waterfront, and paid a grand total of $750 for it. And people at the time said, "You're crazy, you know, why do you want to pay money for that? Just use it." And my granddad said, "I don't think we're always going to be able to just use it. I think probably at some point it's going to need to be under somebody else's ownership." So anyway, they bought that, and they divided it up. The flat there is tapers out to the bank, and so they had the place that had the least amount of flat got the most amount of acreage, and then down to my place, which has the biggest flat but the least amount of acreage. And the old home place is 3.3 acres, and then all of them built cabins there. I'm glad Stuart's not here tonight because we have a disagreement about this next story. So, yeah, they all built cabins, and my family myth or legacy or whatever it was that my grandpa and grandma built the log cabin that I have quite early on in people building their cabins. And they built it back very close to the bank, much further to the west than it is now. But Mabel and Otto got a kit, like a Sears kit house, and they built out right next to the water, which took away some of the view for my grandpa and grandma in the cabin. So my grandfather and grandmother, being quite stubborn, jacked the cabin up, put it on rollers, and rolled her out where the view was what they wanted it, plunked it down, and that's where it sits today. Yeah. And then Ralph and Katie Davis, the other sister, they survived everybody else by quite a number of years. Katie was up in her 90s when she finally died. But they built further to the south, and then they sold a part of theirs to Les and Mary Middlestat, their daughter and son-in-law. And all of that property is still in the family. Some of the Middlestat property, Mary passed away this last year, and so some of that property may pass out of the family, but it's currently still all in the family.
Can you talk about down the hatch?
Yeah, you know, I only heard about when they started, the county started put names on roads. They came around and asked, and Dad said, "Well, we always called it Down the Hatch," so they named the road Down the Hatch, which was a great name. And I think it had to do with, I think some of the people in the family really enjoyed some cocktails. And I think that's probably the origin of Down the Hatch. But then, like in the, I don't know, probably 10 years after the road had been named Down the Hatch, somebody on the beach, I think, complained about it. I don't know why. And that's when it got changed to the rather insipid Agate Lane. I'd much prefer to go back to down the hatch. But I think it was, I don't know, I assume, my grandparents weren't big drinkers, but I assume it was maybe just holiday time, and that's where that came from.
Just make a small formally call as a historic marker, hang it on the same signpost.
I thought about going back to the county and petitioning, maybe because we could do
Yeah,
that.
we could do, well, you know what, those, I think it's Google Maps or Google Earth, it still shows it as down the hatch.
Really?
Because when we've had stuff moved, the movers are like, where's Agate Road? We see down the hatch, we're like, that's it, same one.
Yeah.
So there is still a little
Cool.
confusion, so.
I think you could argue that it's a Mariner reference,
Yeah.
not a drinking
Good.
reference.
Yeah, sometimes those overlap.
More often than not, right?
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
there was a big controversy in naming roads on the island. And it lasted probably 4 or 5 years before they came up with what we have now.
I see, okay,
It was not a pretty sight.
yeah. Maybe it was during that period.
Yeah,
It's just changed.
no.
So kind of shifting gears a little bit, my mother's maiden name was Berenson. Dan Berenson, that works for the county and runs the Public Works Department, is my cousin and my mom's nephew. The Berenson Bridge coming over off the flats was my mom's brother Dwayne, who that was named after. But my mom and dad started dating after World War II. Dad came home from the war and they started dating. My family was not, or my paternal side was not, we're not churchgoers. God's name pretty much only got used when you whacked your thumb with a hammer. But he and mom started dating, and mom's family was very devout. The Berensons were very devout Lutherans. And mom said, you know, I love you and want to hang out with you, but you can't go fishing every Sunday. And so they made an agreement that dad would go to church with mom every other Sunday. And out of going to church with her, he became a Christian. I'm not sure if it was out of conviction or lust, but he became a Christian and then ultimately went on to become a Lutheran minister. And was a Lutheran minister for much of his life. Did some fill-in work here from time to time. Bob and I were talking about that before the meeting tonight. When there was, somebody was gone or there was a lag time between ministers, Dad would fill in here. He also was in Bellingham, Washington, and Sandpoint, Idaho, and campus pastor at Pacific Lutheran. And did ministerial work, but always missed the water. Always missed being on the water. And so, when I was in 8th grade, the Lutheran Church had built a boat to use as like a floating Bible camp. And they needed somebody who could be both kind of a captain and be a minister on the boat. So Dad took that job, and so I ended up growing up working for him on this boat, which was the Christian. This was after she'd been lengthened. That was up in Glacier Bay. So I kind of cut my teeth working for him, and he did that for a number of years. And it was a wonderful way for me to grow up, I'll tell you. Every summer on the boat, primarily with youth groups, but also with adults sometimes. And he did that through my high school years. And then when I got out of high school, I had enough time in, I got my captain's license. At least for a couple days, I was the youngest captain in the U.S. because you had to be 19 to take your test. And on my 19th birthday, I took my test and got my captain's license. So for a couple days, I was the youngest captain. And anyway, my license is up here too, but I've kept that up over the years. So Dad did that, and all the while, some of you probably know about his boat building addiction. Dad loved to build wooden boats, and he was quite good at it, but time and speed were never concerns for him. And so, with them living on the island off and on for a number of years, we moved back here full-time in 1974, and Dad started building on his sailboat, and passed away 10 years ago. Mom and Dad both passed away in December 10 years ago. And the boat is still not finished. Sailboat's still not finished. I passed it on to a builder in Anacortes who is not a lot faster than Dad was. And so that's still something that's being worked on, but beautiful sailboat and beautiful craftsmanship. And my mom was very patient with it. It's probably good for their marriage. But this was always the heart place. Guemes was always the heart place for the family. I know I lived away, I was a minister for 20 years as well, but always with the hope of moving back here. And so I'm in the marine industry now. I run yachts and manage yacht projects and stuff, but I always wanted to get back to Guemes. And in the early 1990s, I bought property that adjoined our old family place, which I now have is back behind the family place. So I got about 14 acres. That butts up against Staps. They have a 20-acre piece, and I've got 10 acres that's right next to theirs. And cleared it, bought an old dozer and cleared it, and was going to plant a commercial fruit orchard back there, but the Western Washington fruit market went bad, and so I didn't do that. But it's one of my happy places. I go back there, and I've got a nice pond, and it makes me happy. What am I not thinking of? Probably lots of things.
Do you have siblings?
I do. I have 3 sisters, for whom Guemes is important to. They're all older than I am, and wiser than I am. But they come around some, but they don't have the same Guemes connection that I guess I do. Yeah. I have 3 daughters. 2 of them live in Mexico. All 3 were living in Mexico until last June, building a house down there in Oaxaca together. And Molly, my middle daughter, came back in June to go to work at the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. She's an RN. Felt like she had to get on with her career, and so she moved back to do that. But the other 2 girls are still in Oaxaca, finishing the house down there. Yeah. But Guemes is their heart place too, and I look forward to a 4th generation of Taylors on the beach. Yeah. I come from a stubborn family, kind of pioneer roots. It's not terribly important to have a lot of monetary wealth, but a love for the land, a love for basic things. I was thinking for a couple of days about what I was going to say tonight, and kind of summary stuff about my family. And they're people that prefer wool over polyester, prefer cutting their own wood over turning up the thermostat. Kind of pioneer spirit, appreciators of basic things, appreciate the land, and maybe it's the Scots part of it, but would just go to the mat before you get rid of any land. And wanting to nurture it and be nurtured by it. That was always really important stuff. And fairly low opinion of government in general. Wanting to not be messed with. Wanting to be self-responsible and be kind to neighbors and good to neighbors, but not so much to have somebody else telling you how to do things. My grandfather Taylor was a very generous man. He had a place on Cap Santa, and he owned down on the flat below Cap San, and he gave the city of Anacortes a pretty good sized chunk of land down there years ago that they used for low-cost housing. And he just gave it to them, and had that kind of a spirit. But if you came around trying to take it from him, he'd probably shoot you. So, yeah, kind of a quirky bunch.
A totally broader question, but prompted by that last set of kind of descriptions of family traits. And I wonder if there's a connection. I've been several places in my life where you don't feel a connection with the community much at all, and you can move easily somewhere else.
Yeah.
But I've been to some places, like I spent a winter in Wenatchee, which is not a place I ever thought of as a destination place or something getting your DNA. But I was amazed to find out all the people whose grandchildren move away and always come back to Wenatchee.
Is that right?
There's
Yeah.
something about that town,
Yeah.
that, and other places I've been, Guemes is one of them, where people seem to never really move away.
Yeah.
It's like it's in their bones, and they always want to come back and try to come back. Do you have any clues from your own experience here on Guemes as to, in addition to what you just said, which I think has a lot to do with it, the place where you can be left alone and not messed with and so on? Have any clues as to why some places have that kind of attraction like Guemes certainly does?
Yeah. Well, I know as a kid, we moved around quite a bit before we moved back here full time, but we'd always be here for the summer. And there was just something about it that wherever we were was okay, but Guemes was always home. And
It's that elusive thing I'm after.
it is. And people have asked me about, wanting to move back most of my life, and the language I've chosen to use is that Guemes is my heart place. It's just my heart place, and
Your heart.
my heart place. Yeah. Yeah.
That question has always intrigued me.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to think about, to ponder. Yeah.
I mean, I know I feel about it like this,
Yeah.
but I don't really can identify what it is.
Yeah. I remember just coming across on the ferry and always feeling like when you got to the Guemes side, it was sort of like,
Yes.
you could breathe. And I still, this is true confession time, I still go to town, this time of year, work is slower. If I go to town and I get over to the Anacortes side and I think, how long do I have to be over here before I can get back to the island again? And there's just something about it that brings peace, and in a way that I think is very special.
When we first came, our dog knew that about Guemes. And always woke up, and however deep asleep, at the turn by City Hall when we turned onto 6 to come over to the ferry.
Yeah.
Was wide awake and knew where he was.
Yeah, isn't that
And
something?
we did too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you
mine
always
started
find-
barking in Marysville. Mine started barking in Marysville.
Yeah. And we'd always look for reasons to delay going home. Well, could we take a later ferry? Or let's stay over tonight, let's go home
Yeah,
early in the morning.
yeah,
It's that kind of feeling.
yeah.
Marty, what happened to the Christian? Is it still,
It is still working. It actually, when it was done working down here, it went to Alaska to an organization called the Lutheran Association of Ministers and Pilots. And she was in southeast Alaska. And what they primarily did was they would take doctors and dentists to small villages and do various kinds of work, particularly with Native Americans in southeast Alaska, as well as doing some regular kind of cruises and stuff. But she did that until about 4 years ago, and then there was a group that bought her from Prince William Sound and took her to Prince William Sound. They cut the mast off, put a helicopter pad on the top, and then they fly in people for like exotic skiing and stuff like that. What a hot tub up there too, believe it or not.
What years did your dad run it?
Came on about 1973, and then he ran it through 77. And then he went back to a church for a couple of years, then he came back to the boat again in about probably about 1984, and then ran it for a number of years. Yeah.
And towed me in with a broken rudder,
Oh, did he really? Yeah?
with a group on board. My brother and I were out up channel, and
Oh, okay,
our rudder broke, and he towed us back in.
interesting. He did some interesting stuff. He later, when he finally left the Christian, he worked with a guy who was kind of an explorer, and he did a trip to the Chukchi Sea on one boat this guy owned. And then he also ran a big, about a 76-foot brigantine in southeast Alaska, doing cruises and whale watches and that kind of stuff. He and Dave Hartford kind of shared that. Yeah.
Marty, there's a lot of Lutherans on your end of the island? Was there a connection between the Knutsons and the Flavors? Not really.
Not really, just happens to be. Yeah, but there are a lot of Lutherans. Yeah. But the island might be sinking a little bit. No, Pete Knutson, Lowell and Shirley's son. He and I fished together in Alaska in '78. We were on a mutiny on a crew in Alaska. So the Knutsons are good friends, but there are a lot of Lutherans. I don't know why.
One more question, do you know who owned the property that you camped on all those years and finally bought? Was that the county or?
It was Jack Kidd.
Oh,
Jack Kidd owned that.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't know him, but that name I think was pretty familiar around here.
He owned this property, he owned a big strip from Mangan Landing up.
Okay. One other little piece of family lore that may or may not have merit, but I was talking to my sisters about it the other night, is I had my great-grandfather, maternal great-grandfather, I believe, had a brother, Calvin Otis Rogers, who was a rancher in Colorado, but then came out here late 1800s. And my sisters, who've done some research, recollection is that he owned some grazing land on Guemes that is now where Ashbacks live. And he owned a chunk of that hillside and some of that back in there. And I don't know if he ran cattle or what he did, but Calvin Otis Rogers.
I think I remember that from Bud's talk, that he may have bought that from Alverson, is that correct?
And there's a very interesting book, it's all genealogy of your whole family, the one that started way back, and do you remember the name of it?
I don't.
And who was the milkman? His name was Whitey Stuber. And his daughter or somebody puts this all together, but I'll get it for you because it tells all about your family.
Okay.
Oh, it's just fascinating.
So which side of your family do you get your amazing memory from? You have so many details and no notes.
My family is storytellers.
Uh-huh.
And I like stories best.
So there was another Rogers family on the island, they actually lived at the Tower House, he had a garage there at one time, do you know if that was a relative at all?
I don't know the answer. Yeah. I don't think so, but I don't know that for sure.
When you say the Tower House, you mean?
On South Shore.
Yeah. One of my favorite things, Ian and I start doing this sometimes, is he'll come over, I'll be over at his place for one thing or another. He tells a story, and I tell a story. That's really my favorite way to communicate.
You should write a book before you forget.
You remember the island as a boy,
Yeah.
and being quite cut over? I mean, do you remember lots of stumps and what was it like in the interior of the island, walking or hiking?
There are certainly places that have been logged. I mean, even on I have the old home place and then the back property, and I've got stumps back there that still have springboard notches in them that are huge. But I've also got some really big second growth timber. And I suspect if you were to look at the island over a number of years, Ian, you might know this better than I, but if you were to look at it over a number of years, I think you'd probably see a whole spectrum of forests. Probably nothing that's true old growth left anymore, but some very mature second growth, and then everything kind of in between.
But you don't particularly remember it as sort of stump-filled. It was
No,
mixed.
not by my time. No, I'm only almost 60, so I'm pretty young.
Very young.
I don't, and I don't know if Guemes was logged that way or not. Probably was. I know.
There was a big logging operation on the island when they had the boatyards
Yeah.
down on the south shore.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a big fire, and I can't remember what year that was, but they had a big fire that went through the whole south end of the island.
Yeah.
It took out a lot of timber.
Yeah.
I'll give you a little teaser. I think this spring I'm gonna have Ian and I have been talking about that, about the history of logging on the island. So don't give away too much right now.
I know that my log cabin on the beach, the logs that went into that were cut on Guemes, and then they skidded them down over the hill, and Grandpa and Grandma peeled them and started building the cabin with it. I know when they got ready to set the ridgepole, my uncle and dad were there to help, and Dad said he was never so mad in his life, because he said my grandpa was a boat builder, perfectionist, so up he'd put it, oh, it's not right.
Down it comes.
Ridgepole again, back and forth, so, yeah. I also know that my granddad, when he ran the shipyard in Anacortes and they were doing wood construction, he said he could always tell when they got lumber that had come off of Cyprus. Because stuff from Cyprus was always about twice as heavy as any place else. The fur bone, slow growing.
Be like the same size tree, the same dimension would be.
Or, yeah, or say they had a plank or a beam of some kind. The same size from a different place would weigh a lot less than the cypress wood did.
So it had closer rings.
I imagine, yeah. Denser and,
You know, the Stradivarius instruments might have been built from wood from the Maunder Minimum, which was a mini ice age way back when, and it
Huh.
made really dense wood.
Is that right?
That's one thing that made them different.
Oh, amazing.
Any more questions?
Go Seahawks?
Go Seahawks. Well, thank you, Martin. Appreciate you coming.
Thanks for having me.
I can refer to what the person has.
My uncle